every week when they go to church. And then the other side is the scientists who are telling them something different. But as I drew it here, we get a little arrow because we don't do a good job of talking to people. Most scientists everywhere spend most of their time talking to other scientists, and we all take evolution for granted. There's no problem at all. Or we're talking to our students who are willing to pay us to come into our classroom and listen to us tell them these things. But there's not as much outreach as there should be. If you pick the average person in the United States and you say, okay, how often have you heard a lecture from a scientist? Most will say never. They just have not. Not even in high school did they hear about this stuff. It's a great void. And yet if you ask them, how often have you heard somebody explain creationism to you? You'll probably get an answer on the order of every week. It's that constant. So it's hammered into them. And that's why they're going along. It's all they know. It's all they hear. Now, this leads to some very peculiar situations. Here, for instance, some of you may have heard of this. James Usher, the primate of Ireland, put together his chronology of creation. This is a 17th century idea. This is the infamous one. This is the one where he went through all the generations of the Bible and he added them up and figured out exactly when the earth was created. And the earth was created in 4004 BC. And furthermore, it was like October 23rd, 4004 BC, at 9 a.m. in the morning, etc. This was all the work of James Usher. And I have to be fair, this was a 17th century idea, and it wasn't that bad. That was a reasonable approach, given the information available in the 17th century. Okay, this happens to be the 21st century, if any of you have forgotten. In the 17th century, this is a reasonable approach. Let's go through the historical documentation, see what the historical documentation says. And yeah, if you go just to the Bible, it says the earth is about 6,000 years old. And he wrote this up, and it spread fairly far, and people liked it. But the thing is that very quickly, if you talk to the intelligent, literate, professional classes in Europe at the time, they got discarded. Painlessly. There was no problem moving beyond this. In particular, with the Industrial Revolution, people started looking for coal mines, started exploring geology, and it becomes clear that this is not adequate, that there is another source of information. And these were people who did not throw out the Bible. They said the Bible's just fine. They were practicing Christians. They said, okay, we got more information here. We got all this stuff from geology. And that's telling us that the earth is much older. So we should add that to the account. It's very sensible. So this is an early attempt at figuring out the age of the earth. But here's the weird thing. I actually pulled this picture out of an ad that I was sent by a right-wing news site called WorldNet Daily, which we usually abbreviate as Wingnut Daily. It was an ad sent to me. They were offering a copy of his book for sale, of James Usher's book, and look what they're saying about it. It's considered not only a literary classic, but also an accurate reference. It hasn't been considered an accurate reference for 300 years. And it's saying it's highly regarded for its preciseness, about the timeline, etc., and the earth is only around 6,000 years old, and the fact that we don't have Usher's chronology in our Bibles anymore is evidence of the church's backsliding into deceptive ideas of evolution. This is an ad that I'm being sent in the 21st century. And I got this and I said, hey, you know, I'd really like to have a copy of James Usher's book. It sounds like a good historical reference. And that's what it is. It's a little piece of history. It's worth keeping and studying for that reason. But it is not an accurate description of the history of the world, because he didn't have the full amount of information that we have now. But it's still being touted in the United States as accurate. So let me just say a little bit about the background here. This is peculiar for another reason, and that is that if you went back in the United States 100 years, if you went back to the early years of the 20th century and you talked to creationists at that time, there were many creationists even then, they would have thought this was insane. They would have said, no, you can't take the Bible literally. This isn't an accurate way to do this. This has been superseded. That 100 years ago, creationists in the United States were actively trying to reconcile their Christianity with science. And it didn't work. And here's my little diagram of the history of creationism in the United States, just to summarize it all in a very brief way. If you go back to 100 years, what you find is that most of the people were what were called populists, that they weren't committed to a creationist idea. They weren't committed to the idea that the world was 6,000 years old. What they were committed to was liberal ideals. Again, we've had a major reversal in politics in the United States. These were people who were largely Midwestern people. They came from Minnesota, they came from Kansas and Arkansas and all these other places in the middle of the country. They were very fervent in their religion, and they were also very appreciative of the virtues of science. And so what they wanted to do is they wanted to reconcile the two. They wanted to bring these two together. What happened, though, was, I mentioned this earlier, this trial in 1925, the Scopes trial. And some of you may have heard of this. It got made into a movie, Inherit the Wind, which is a little bit inaccurate. But the key thing that was going on at that time is that it brought a couple of cultures into clash. That there were cultures in the United States that were pushing this populist notion, that they were very down-to-earth agricultural types. Then there were the Eastern elites, and they got together, and the Eastern elites essentially ridiculed and mocked the yokels from Arkansas and made fun of them in this trial, and it hurt. So they were roundly ridiculed. People were left feeling very unhappy about this whole experience, even though they actually won the Scopes trial. The creationists won the Scopes trial, but it did not generate any good feelings. And what it brought out into the open is a growing conflict between conservative forces that were largely agricultural and forces of modernity who were bringing in new ideas and were changing the economy and the culture of the United States at that time. So that became a big conflict. What happened after this was a gradual hardening of positions. Then what happened is after this, for instance, one of the highlights of the Scopes trial was William Jennings Bryan, who was the creationist, being brought onto the stand. And they asked him, you know, how old do you think the Earth is? And Bryan was fairly honest. He said, well, I'm not really sure, but I believe that the Earth is probably pretty old. And the interrogator in the trials just hammered on him and tried to get him to say specific that. He said, well, you know, the book of Genesis isn't specific. A day could be 1,000 years, a day could be 1,000,000 years, etc., etc. And he was treated as an idiot for this, which is a little unfair, because that was actually the most common interpretation of the Bible at that time. That most of the people who thought seriously about the Bible thought this was how it happened. That the Bible was not a literal description, it was a metaphorical description, which is kind of what we want now as people start thinking about it metaphorically. So anyway, got ridiculed for this. And what happened after this is that people started hardening their positions. They started being more explicit in how they interpret the Bible and how they explain the world in terms of that. So what you had is a split then between a group of people who were, most of the people at this time were old Earth creationists. Old Earth creationists means that they did not believe in this. They rejected Usher's interpretation. They said the world is really old, and that the Bible is to be treated as a metaphorical document. There's a few of these that are still around. They're not very popular anymore, because ultimately old Earth creationism turned out to have all kinds of difficulties with the scientific evidence as well, but it kind of got lost. This is not the most common interpretation now. The other thing that happened is this peculiar event. This fellow, George McCready Price. I'm just curious, who has heard of George McCready Price? Oh, a few of you, very good. Seventh-day Adventists. Do you happen to be Seventh-day Adventists? No, okay. Something really strange happened here. There is a sect of Christianity called Seventh-day Adventists who were led by a prophetess, Ellen White. And she was providing an extra source of information. Just as I told you in the early days, you know, Usher was okay, but when you get more information in geology, you start putting those together, and you say, okay, well, we superseded Usher. Ellen White was providing a collection of information to supersede other interpretations. And Ellen White was a prophetess who would go into these trances and have visions. And one of her visions, she was actually literally escorted by Jesus through the creation week. And she came out of her vision and said, yes, the world was created 6,000 years ago, and it was over precisely 7 days.